All right, so this is the final news roundup for the past week, at least as of right now. This one's talking about motherboards. As you likely know, Intel's B and H series chipsets have now officially launched. This means that every motherboard manufacturer on the planet has decided it's time to take the alphabet and scramble it to see what kind of concoctions it can come up with. Some of these vendors have 30 boards they've launched just in the B660 and H610 lines alone. There's also H670 in there, not counted for most of these. So we're going to be going over some of the most interesting motherboards that were announced last week. As a reminder, these haven't officially really shipped yet, or at least for the most part around the world. So we're looking at these from a news roundup, trying to figure out which ones out of the more than 100 that have launched are actually worth paying attention to and which ones are maybe a little ridiculous. Before that, this video is brought to you by Arctic and the Liquid Freezer 2 line of liquid coolers, which tested among the best in our thermal charts for CPU coolers. The Arctic Liquid Freezer series has had continual advancement since our original review, with updates in the mounting kit, including an AMD offset bracket for better thermals, and a longer warranty. Arctic also has its MX5 thermal compound, available on the market now if you need some thermal paste for your regular maintenance. Learn more at the links in the description below. So as anticipated, anything that's not Z690 should generally be cheaper than Z690, but that's not always true. A couple of the boards in the list here today in the B series chipsets are over $200, some of them $240 plus. Very expensive for a board that's not fully enabled, but we'll be talking about why those might be that expensive and which ones you should be avoiding. As for the chipset differences, we're going to put the table on the screen from Intel's press release. We talked about these a couple days ago. If you would like to learn more about what the chipset differences are beyond the table that we're putting on the screen, you can check out our Intel keynote coverage where we go over it in a little more detail there. That talks about some of the key changes, like, for example, the DMI drop-off as you get down to the lower end. At the ultra-low end, H610 is really an extreme low-end board. You shouldn't be paying attention to that for any kind of decent, really gaming PC, even in the budget class. The price savings aren't worth a lot of the features you lose there, but useful for a media system or something like that, some kind of home office box, something simple. Anyway, the biggest change, obviously, is that Z690 supports CPU overclocking, and the rest of them do not. Simple enough. As for memory overclocking, that's now supported on everything except for H610. So you still won't be able to run XMP above the Intel CPU spec on H610. As for memory channels, Intel originally had a slide out that said it could only do single channel for H610, but the company since corrected it. It's actually dual channel for H610, except it's one DPC. Still a downgrade. Now, memory overclocking here also means enabling XMP if it is beyond the officially supported spec on the CPU's datasheet. And the CPU supported spec for memory is often exceptionally low. You can get way higher than that with XMP, and it doesn't really count as overclocking. So for the CPUs that have come out, the ones that make the most sense for these boards are the non-K-SKU boards. If you're new to this industry, K-SKU Intel CPUs are unlocked. That means they can be overclocked, whereas the non-K-SKU, so anything without a K at the end, no K suffix, that doesn't have all of the overclocking features available to you. It is artificially locked and constrained. It's cheaper, but it means that you won't be able to overclock it even if you have a Z-series board. So clearly here then, the takeaway is that B and H boards are the most suitable for non-K CPUs, like maybe an i5-12400F or something of that kin. All right, ASUS, ASRock, BioStar, Colorful, Gigabyte, and MSI all put out major announcements in the past couple days. We'll be going over all of them. There's more than 100 boards. We're not going to talk about each board, but we'll be talking about each of the major companies' sort of roundups and the most interesting. Keep in mind as well, we haven't tested these yet. Almost no one has. Saw a couple early tests out there, but not many, and that's because they were just announced. So this is just news coverage. We are not making any judgments on the actual quality of the board at this time. ASUS has updated its ROG line. It's got ROG Strix, Tough Gaming is in there as well, Prime, Pro Art, and Pro lines all were updated in the last week. This includes boards starting primarily available in Q1, so just the next couple months you'll see these popping up. Prices range from $100 at the very low end, that's for an H610 micro ATX form factor motherboard, and $240 at the high end for full ATX B660 motherboards. $240 for a non-Z motherboard is absolutely brutal. It's not the first time we've seen it. This has happened for years, but it doesn't make it any easier to pay for. It's, you know, you're really at the cheaper end of Z690. You might gain some features in I/O and things like that, where you're trading cost of the chipset for cost of something else. But for the most part, just if you're in that price range, start seriously looking at Z690 and determine if it actually makes sense for you to cut off some of the chipset features for whatever you're gaining, if anything, in the other features. The tough gaming B660M Plus Wi-Fi D4 looks like a probably solid mid-tier micro ATX board at $180. It comes in below the cost of the Z690 offerings, at least today, and has many of the same features. It's got a 10+ one-phase VRM. We'd need to look at the actual MOSFETs once it comes out. PCIe Gen 5 by 16 GPU connectivity, 2 PCIe Gen 4 by 4 M.2 drive slots, 8 rear I/O USB ports, 4 internal USB headers, and an internal Thunderbolt header. There's also Intel Wi-Fi 6, 2.5 GBE for Ethernet connectivity, and multiple RGB and fan headers. It stays with the same sort of industrial aesthetics as the past
tough gaming
components by providing a rear I/O cover and heat sinks for the VRM, primary M.2 drive, and B660 chipset. The B660M Plus Wi-Fi D4 packs a versatile feature set into the micro ATX form factor, so this is one of the ones to pay attention to. The H670 Pro Wi-Fi D4 is another tough option. It's brutal on cost, though, at $230, so we'll just skip past it. At that price, again, it's worth starting to look at cheap Z690 boards instead. Onto the ROG Strix lineup. This now includes 3 new B660 motherboards. The most interesting of the 3 is the ROG Strix B660i Gaming Wi-Fi. At $220, it's a relatively affordable mini ITX board that hits the same price as the entry-level Z690 boards. It's also the only board in the ASUS B&H lineup to support DDR5 besides the ROG Strix B660F Gaming Wi-Fi. But ASUS hasn't officially put a product page up for it yet. When we did the Z690 roundup a few weeks back, the lowest cost ITX board at the time was almost $300, and it wasn't amazing. The ROG Strix B660i Gaming Wi-Fi is the kind of ITX board that we were recommending viewers wait for. The price is more acceptable here. The VRM is probably reasonable depending on the full spec at 8+1 stages. PCIe Gen 5 by 16 slot is nice to have, and 2 PCIe Gen 4 by 4 M.2 slots provide connectivity in areas that have the highest available bandwidth. The I/O offerings are more than most users will need, and aesthetics are right in line with the past ROG Strix motherboards. The only other offering in the ROG Strix lineup is the B660A Gaming Wi-Fi D4. It's maybe a nice looking board, but it's $240. It's another board that we'd steer clear of in favor of a low-end Z690 motherboard. As for something that's potentially good value, there's the Prime H670 Plus D4. D4 here, if you haven't put it together, is for DDR4 as opposed to DDR5. That's maybe a good value at $160. We would need to test to really be certain at this point. It's one we're going to pay attention to, though. It is not flashy. It does, however, provide all the necessities to be the backbone of a non-K Alder Lake system. Maybe you put an i5 or an i3 in there or something like that. At this price point, it holds on to older technology with DDR4. DDR4 is plenty good for really most of what you're doing. You lose some of the upgradability, but at the lower end, saving money on D4 versus D5 is maybe more valuable, so you can put it towards some other component that has more immediate use anyway. Now, it's also running PCIe Gen 4 by 16 for the GPU connection, so that's dated, but again, PCIe Gen 5 cards are not available today anyway, and you're probably going to be limited elsewhere in the system before you have a RTX 4090 or whatever that would even make use of the bandwidth. There's also support for 3 M.2 drives, 2.5 GBE, 8 USB ports, and multiple fan and RGB headers. And finally, we'll flash a list of the other motherboards in the Prime lineup with the respective prices, at least as we know them so far. Tom's Hardware has a pretty good list on these ASUS motherboard prices. There are both B660 and H610 chipset variants. The boards are reasonably priced, and they understandably have their own limitations depending on sort of where they fall in the stack. The most glorious throwback model from ASUS is the Pro B660M-C D4-CSM. It's green. Just plain old PCB green. It's $130. It has both mouse and keyboard PS2 ports. It's got a VGA port, no USB Type-C, and it has 2 COM ports, an LPT port, and brings back those IEEE 1284 days. This has uses primarily in non-consumer, non-enthusiast space, though. But it does actually have uses despite being sort of easy to make fun of for being green. Up next, MSI had a lot to announce as well. Well, not quite as many as ASUS, but good amount to start with. It's got 9 new boards in the B&H series, much easier to digest than what Gigabyte's offering at something, it had like 30 boards listed or something. Pricing is available on 8 of them, but not yet available for the top of the line H670 board. The lowest end H610 board from MSI starts at $115, but H610 again is the most hindered out of all of the chipsets Intel is currently offering, and so you should really be aware of your options. If you could bump it up a little more, if it's going to be a performance system, you should. If it's not going to be a performance system, you're doing home office, Word, browsing, then it's fine. The current price cap, which is sure to increase, is $200, the MAG B660 Tomahawk Wi-Fi. The Tomahawk series has historically been well received, at least recently, but $200 is again encroaching on Z690 territory. In fact, it's encroaching on MSI's own board. The Z690 boards we looked at from MSI recently performed fine and were about $220. MSI's only H670 board, the MAG H670 Tomahawk Wi-Fi DDR4, is somewhat confusing. H670 can't overclock the CPU, so there's no reason really to put a large 14-phase VRM on one, or at least not a reasonable reason. And there's likewise no need to feed the board with 2 8-pin power connectors. Someone buying an i9 12900K might want features like that, but anyone buying that CPU should obviously purchase a Z690 motherboard to make use of that expensive letter K they're paying for. And to that end, maybe it's better we don't know how much over $200 this motherboard is going to be sold for. The MSI B660 and H610 lineups are more affordable than Z690, but they don't necessarily pack more value based on what we're seeing right now. The MAG B660 Tomahawk Wi-Fi D4 is currently underwhelming at $190. It only supports DDR4 and PCIe Gen 4 and Wi-Fi 6, and each of these is a step down from the best available, while being within striking distance of the Z690 boards that offer, well, better that in every capacity. The MAG B660M Mortar Wi-Fi looks promising at first glance because of DDR5 support, but it's $190. Looking more closely at the specs, we see that a PCIe Gen 4x16 slot was used instead of PCIe 5x16. Again, that technically doesn't matter today, kind of limiting going forward and at that price class. The thing with these boards, if you haven't been in a few of these cycles now, this always happens where it's just like add-in board partner GPUs, where you might have something like an RTX 3060 or in the past a GTX 1060, and the highest end of those will cost more than the next step up. Let's take the 2060. The highest end 2060 costs more than a 2070. That's silly, but that's the way it works as the board partners, in this case motherboard partners, often the same group as video cards, try to throw more and more things on there to create a halo product that they can say, look shiny, and then hope you buy down the stack. And they're competing with their, obviously, the other big motherboard makers at this in this game as well. So all that to say, historically, the highest priced non-Z series Intel chipset boards are really not worth buying, and you don't gain that much more versus maybe $30 cheaper on the same chipset or $40 cheaper on the same chipset, while you lose quite a bit from the $20 more expensive Z690. It's a classic sales technique where they're giving you a couple price points. They're giving you high, medium, low. They're showing you medium right now and hoping that you pick high. But that's sort of the game that's played. So anyway, these $200 B series boards are they're not bad boards. It's just the price is kind of in weird, nebulous, should I really be buying this territory? Anyway, in price list released by MSI, there are 2 B660 boards in the Pro line. Both are listed at $150. If either of those boards has a similar specification set to the MAG B660 Tomahawk D4, we'd consider them a good value. So those are the ones to pay attention to in the near future. There's also a pair of H610 boards. The Pro H610M B DDR4 and Pro H610M G DDR4 are both sparse, but they have everything necessary for a functional motherboard. But then again, Alienware has everything necessary for a functional company, and there are limits to what physics can achieve. These H610 boards are limited in many ways. There are 2 DIMM slots, there's no DP output, and there's only 1 M.2 drive slot. Even the prices aren't attractive at $115 and $120, with that $5 difference amounting in the form of an RGB header. The ASUS H610 offerings are a better deal here and would be more interesting than these ones. Gigabyte's up next. On Gigabyte's website, it has 30 individual listings for motherboards. Some of them are repeats, a little confusing, but 30 listings for B660 and H610 alone. We'll only focus on a few of them here. It's a lot to go through. The brand names are all familiar from previous launches, though. You've got Aorus Master motherboards, Gaming X AX, things like that, Pro AX in there as well. So to simplify things, the lineup is basically a list of combinations of Wi-Fi preference, DDR4, DDR5, and then the category of the price tier that the board is situated in. Picking a few then, Gigabyte's B660M Aorus Pro motherboard is in the micro ATX camp. We don't have a price on this. It's alongside the B660M Gaming X AX DDR4 board, and both run 2 full-length PCIe slots and have large, minimally diced heat sinks on the VRM components. The Aorus Pro AX hosts 4 DDR5 DIMM slots. It has rear I/O that's fairly heavy on USB present at 9 total for USB Type-A ports, and it has sufficient interface and port availability for smaller builds, or at least most of them. We'd assume it'll run close enough to Z690 low-end boards that'd be worth considering bumping up, but being micro ATX puts it in potentially a more competitive camp on price, at least at the high end, that is. At the smallest end of things, the B660i Aorus Pro board runs DDR4, which is helpful for cost saving for the end user versus D5, and it's equipped with 2 DIMM slots to meet the form factor. This is often useful as an overclocking feature, but sometimes unintentionally, as it gets the memory closer to the socket and it keeps the modules packed together. Whether or not that's true here will depend on Gigabyte's memory topology and BIOS functionality, and Gigabyte's BIOS has historically been a mess, so it'll take time for that to improve. Regardless, the board runs dense stacks of aluminum on top of the VRM covering the rear I/O, although the actual surface area is sparse. Fortunately, these boards can't OC anyway, so they don't really need the surface area to soak the heat they're dealing with. The bottom has a PCIe by 16 slot. It's got a handful of SATA ports, a couple fan headers up near the top of the board. Overall, we don't see any bizarrely placed headers that would be abnormally inconvenient or awkward to reach, running cables across the board, for example, and that's been common in ITX boards, so that's an upside from ease of installation. As for ATX, the B660 Aorus Master has at least 3 variations listed on Gigabyte's website. There's the B660 Aorus Master DDR5, B660 Aorus Master DDR4, and those two look otherwise visually identical, and B660 Aorus Master DDR4 again, a second time because we don't know why, it's just listed twice. This is a board that projects Z690 features onto a B660 chipset. It has the LEDs, or most of them, that you'd find on the I/O cover. It's got a ton of metal mounted everywhere, mostly unnecessarily for what should be a lower end option. But they want to be the high end of the low end, or something. There aren't any 7-segment displays or advanced debug features, and no benchtop buttons. But there is a gigantic VRM at 16+1+1 and an 8+4 power setup for what is ultimately a board that can only OC memory and nothing else. So it's made to look like an enthusiast Z690 board, but it's not one. It'll definitely cost close to the same as one, and it's the high end of a low-end chipset, so it's going to be hard to, it gets dubious whether it's worth buying at this point. For a cheaper, more sensible board, Gigabyte also has the B660 DS3H-AXD4. We don't know if this is going to be any good. We haven't tested it, but it's the one that we're kind of looking at right now for maybe getting in. We'll see if we have time for it. Anyway, makes the most sense for non-K CPUs from this list we've looked at thus far. Although we haven't tested it, it looks, it's maybe promising, but there's always room for Gigabyte to blow an opportunity. The component choice and the layout look congruent with a cheaper board. It's heavy on the PCIe lanes, makes us wonder whether maybe it's targeted more towards mining users, but ultimately there are too many boards, especially Gigabyte right now, to really know them all in and out. So especially when these are just news items, we'll cap it here. If you see one that's interesting for us to talk about in the future, leave a comment in the comment section below. ASRock dropped 18 B and H series motherboards. At the moment, it's showcasing the most H670 offerings out of any of the board manufacturers we talked about so far. ASRock also made it a point to include an ITX offering in all 3 chipsets. No pricing or availability yet, though. Speaking of ITX, the H670 ITX AX might be a good performance to price balance. It's got a sensible 8-phase VRM. It has PCIe Gen 5x16 graphics support. It's got 2 M.2 PCIe Gen 4x4 slots, 3 different network interfaces, including Wi-Fi 6E, and it supports DDR4 at high advertised clocks. This mini ITX board is worth tracking until ASRock announces its motherboard pricing, so keep an eye on the H670 ITX AX. Of the 9 B660 boards, there are 2 that support D5, and of those 2, the B660M Pro RS D5 is the only one that also supports PCIe Gen 5. Again, this isn't a huge feature to focus on, especially right now, but in this class of board either. It is one we want to draw attention to just because some people really care about sort of future use of their boards, and that would be a potential limiting factor But we need to see, it's hard to know how much it matters until we have a card that actually uses it, so we can see to what extent the extra bandwidth benefits the card. Anyway, if this micro ATX board is priced lower than $220, as is priced on the ASUS B660i mini ITX board, then it would be arguably the best deal of the roundup, keeping in mind that ITX boards are more expensive in general. The biggest knock against this board is its rear I/O. There are 4 USB 5 gigabit per second ports, but they're provided through an AS media hub instead of the chipset. The H610M HDVP D5 is one of the 5 H610 choices from ASRock. This one is built around Intel's lowest cost chipset, yet ASRock designed it to support expensive DDR5 memory, so the choices are conflicting. ASRock is pairing DDR5 with underwhelming features like Gigabit LAN and a PCI slot. It provides a PCIe Gen 4x16 graphics slot and an M.2 slot for storage. And the rear I/O is sufficient for a wide age range of peripherals, providing connections to VGA, DVI, serial, DP, and HDMI. And finally, a couple quick ones just for fun. We don't typically cover BioStar or Colorful too much on the channel, but we did want to call attention to a couple of their motherboards just because they're different and unique. The BioStar B660 GTA is very Tron Legacy style in its look. It has blue, white, and gray PCB trace type paint across the PCB and the heat sinks. Ignoring the entirety of the board's features, we haven't really looked at that. It's nice to at least see something other than modern day all black plus RGBs layout that we see on most boards. In the mid maybe 2004 to 10 area, it was common that blue and black was the most prevalent motherboard, at least that I can remember. After that, in the maybe 2010 to 14 era, there was a lot of black and red, and now it's become all black and RGB, and that's kind of what you get. So it's nice to see something it's an old idea, but at this point it's new again. It's nice to see. So maybe a cheaper, different design to diversify the market without just throwing RGB LEDs on it, which would be more expensive anyway. Motherboards are still a primary focal point in the build, so having something different is good to see. Although BioStar's quality, historically for us, has been somewhat questionable, so we can't really comment on how good the board itself is, but something to look at. Maybe this will encourage other manufacturers to pursue similarly different ideas. As for Colorful, the company introduced a micro ATX board in the B660 chipset lineup. It's the Gaming Frozen V20. This one is an all-white PCB following the snow motif that Thermaltake likes to reference, and it mixes in well with matched aluminum coloring on its heat sinks. A large 66 is representative of the B660 chipset, but printed in almost jersey-like or mech-like letters. Price is TBD on these as well, so we've got prices for about half the boards in this list, but it's still all fluctuating. A lot of the manufacturers like to wait and see what the other ones announce at the shows, so they can then price their boards accordingly after that. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. There are a lot of boards out there. If there's one that you think is exceptionally interesting, not just interesting, but like, hey, you need to pay attention to this, please leave us a comment below. We'll likely see it. We'll try and get one in and look at it. But that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab one of our Disappointment Tour 2021 shirts. We'll see you all next time.